Now this morning I covered and tried to lay a foundation. Because I think to understand giving, in fact to understand the Scriptures, you have to have foundations. You can't build unless you have a foundation. And so to know how they give under the law, you have to find out what is the law. And we found out that the law is a covenant that God made with the children of Israel. And we found that God didn't make this covenant with any Gentiles, any Gentile nations. It was made only with the children of Israel. And when God made the covenant was ratified. And then the covenant became the constitution of the children of Israel. Now we have, instead of 2 million plus Israelites standing there in the desert, you have one nation standing there in the desert. Now, God is, we might say, is the president of Israel. It's a theocracy. God says, I'm going to run it. I'm calling the shots. I will lead you and I will guide you and I will bless you. But any government has to have a tax system because there are expenses to running a government. And so tonight we're going to get into required giving and also free will offerings. And as I explained this morning, required giving isn't really giving at all. It's a taxation. It's something it's an obligation. It's a debt that you pay. And as I was trying to explain this morning about income tax, in the same way, now if you go into a grocery store and buy a loaf of bread and it's $1, then they will charge you 7 cents tax. Now you don't have a choice as to whether you pay the tax or not. If you want the bread, you pay the tax. And you aren't giving that money to the state. They're charging you. You're paying that money to the state. So we find here that Israel did have a system of required giving, and it's very important. But now please keep in mind that God said, if you will pay your obligations, I will really bless you. And so it wasn't a form of just extraction. It wasn't like pulling teeth. God said, you give, and then you see what I do. He said, if you will give, I will really bless you. And God did, anytime they give. In other words, He said, if you give, you won't miss it. I will bless you far above the taxes that you owe or the obligations that you owe. But first of all, I want to get into the tithes. Now, there were many more obligations for Israel, but the first one that we discussed, there's 3 types of tithes that Israel had to pay. There was called the Lord's tithe or the Levite tithe. Then there was called the festival tithe, and then there was called the poor tithe. All right, so there was 3, not 1 tithe. Now the word tithe isn't a religious word. It's just a mathematical word that means 10%. That's what tithe means. But there was 3 tithes that Israel had to pay. Now first of all, I want to show you, and if you will turn to Numbers, we're going to look at the Levite tithe, or what was called the Lord's tithe. It's in Numbers, the 18th chapter, and I'll begin with the 21st verse. Now, the Levite tribe, or the Lord's tithe, was for a specific purpose. Now, the specific purpose was that the Lord's tithe was to support the tribe of Levi. Now, what you say, well, why would they do that? Now, there's 12 tribes. One of them is the tribe of Levi. Because out of all of the tribes, God said, now there's going to be one tribe, and it's going to be the Levites. Now the Levites will be priests. Now the Levites, the job of the Levites will be to take care of the temple. Now keep this in mind, all priests are Levites. But not all Levites are priests. But the whole tribe was designated to do the work of the temple. Now, Aaron's sons, from Aaron was a Levite, and from his lineage, his son, were the priests and the high priest. But the rest of the tribe of Levi had other things to do. In other words, when they were in the wilderness, every time they moved, it was the tribe of Levi that rolled up the curtains, took all the tent poles and the sockets and all of the furniture, and God said, don't any of you other Israelites touch that. He said, that's the job of the Levites. So when they would move, the whole tribe of Levi, their job was to take care of the sanctuary and take care of the tabernacle and take care of all of those things. That was their job. All through the history, it was the tribe of Levi's job and obligation to take care of the temple, and that was their only obligation. But God said this. Now He said, when you get over into the promised land, He told Joshua and Moses, He said, you're going to divide up the promised land. But now, keep in mind, on one side of the river, you have 2.5 tribes because they didn't want to go into the promised land. Gad, 1/2 tribe of Manasseh, and another tribe, and I don't remember which one, and some of you Bible scholars probably remember which tribe it was. Anybody here remember? I can look it up and give it to you later, but nevertheless. Reuben, that's right, Reuben. 2.5 tribes stayed on this side of Jordan. The rest of the tribes of Israel crossed over into the promised land. But now when they got in the promised land, God commissioned them and told them, now the Levites are to own any land in the promised land. How many knew that? They own no land. He said they are not to inherit any land over there in the promised land. They are servants. He says, I have given the tribe of Levi to the rest of the nation to bless you, to serve you. They're your ministers, they're your priests, and they take care of all the temple, but they said they're not to have any land. But they were given 48 cities because they had to have somewhere to live. Now the cities were approximately 1.5 miles square, and also God gave them just a few feet, I don't remember how many feet, but just a few feet outside the walls of each city so they could have a small garden, or they could have just a few sheep or something like that, a vegetable garden or something like that. But He said they're not to own any land. He said their job is just to take care of the temple. But He says they've got to be supported, and their families have to be supported. And He says, you're going to do that with what's called the Lord's tithe. Now notice what He commands in verse 21. And behold, I have given the children of Levi all the tenth in Israel for an inheritance, for their service which they serve, even the service of the tabernacle of the congregation. Neither must the children of Israel henceforth come nigh the tabernacle of the congregation, lest they bear sin and die. In other words, He says, now look, only the tribe of Levi can take care of the temple, only the high priest can do the priestly functions, and the Jews and all of the rest of the tribes, people from the tribe of Judah or any other tribe, they can't do this. He said, only the Levites can do this. He says, but the tribes, wait a minute, let me start with verse 23. But the Levites shall do the service of the tabernacle of the congregation, and they shall bear their iniquity. It shall be a statute forever throughout your generations, that among the children of Israel they have no inheritance. He said forever the Levites will not have any inheritance. Forever they'll never own any land in the promised land. But He says they're just a gift to you, but support them with your tithe. Now, but the tithes of the children of Israel, which they offer as a heave offering unto the Lord, I have given to the Levites to inherit. Therefore I have said unto them among the children of Israel, they shall have no inheritance. So He's making it very plain, and He keeps repeating the fact that, look, support these Levites because they don't have any inheritance. They're not going to have farms. They're not going to have ranches. They can't be shepherds. They are strictly a tribe of priests and a blessing to the rest of the nation. But He says, support those priests. Now here's how God commanded they do it. Now let's say, for instance, you are the tribe of Levi, and out of this row right here are the priests. They're Levites too, but they're the priests. All right? He says, now when this 10% comes in, when this tithe comes in, the whole tribe of Levi receives it. Then, He says, for the tribe of Levi to tithe. And they're to take all that came in, and they're to take the best of it, because keep in mind, what they tithed back then, very little of it was money. It was mostly grain and livestock and that sort of thing, fruit and vegetables. That's what they did. But he says, all of you Levites, you pay 10% of that to these priests right here. That supports their families. But he said, you be sure you give them the best of it. Now that's the Levite tithe. That's what's called the Lord's tithe. So all of Israel was to tithe to the tribe of Levi because they had no land. They couldn't farm. Then all of the tribe of Levi was to pay 10% just to the priest to support their families. Now that's what God intended. And he said, you do that. You do that. Because the rest of you have farms, you have ranches. But here's something else that's interesting. Now everyone in Israel paid the Lord's tithe. Everyone in Israel, even the tribe of Levi, had to pay the Levite tribe, but the only ones that were exempt from that were the priests. They paid no tithes whatsoever. They received tithes. They didn't pay tithes. Now, if we want to put that in perspective, see, I could say, the preacher don't supposed to give. You see what I'm saying? I mean, if we're going to take that law and apply it today, we say, hey, the preachers aren't supposed to give. You people give, I receive. All right, now. So that was the Lord's tithe. That was the first tithe. Okay, but then they had another tithe. He says, now do this also every year. And this is called the festival tithe. Now, let's see, where would you want to turn for that? Turn to that. Deuteronomy, 14th chapter of Deuteronomy, 22nd verse. Thou shalt surely tithe all the increase of thy seed that the field bringeth forth year by year. In other words, everything you raise, you bring it, 10%. And thou shalt eat before the Lord thy God in the place which he shall choose to place his name there. The tithe of thy corn, of thy wine, and of thine oil, and of thy firstlings, of thy herds, and of thy flocks, that thou mayest learn to fear the Lord thy God always. And he says, and if the way be too long for thee, so that thou art not able to carry it, or if the place be too far from thee, which the Lord thy God shall choose to set his name there, when the Lord thy God hath blessed thee, then shalt thou turn it into money. In other words, if you can't carry all of this 10% that you raised, if it's too far, sell it, get it in money, now, and bring it. And thou shalt bestow that money for whatsoever thou so lustest after, for oxen, for sheep, for wine, or for strong drink, for whatsoever thou so lusteth, or desireth, and thou shalt eat there before the Lord thy God, and thou shalt rejoice, thou and thine house. Oh, now notice this. And the Levite that is within thy gates, thou shalt not forsake him, for he hath no part nor inheritance. So notice what they do. Every year they've got the Lord's tithe, which is 10%, and then every year they have the festival tithe. Now the whole purpose of the festival tithe, it's like a big family reunion. It's like a big potluck dinner. He said, I want all you Israelites to bring 10% of what you raise, and you bring it there to the temple and share it with the Levites. But he said, I want you to share it with your wives and with your children, with your daughters, with your servants, with all of Israel, because that was to promote unity. And also, it was a time of fellowship. But they were to do that every year. Okay, then there was another tithe. Now, right under that, on the 28th verse, every third year, they brought another tithe. Okay, so here's what they had. The first year, they brought the Lord's tithe and the festival tithe. That's 20%, right? The second year, they brought the Lord's tithe and the festival tithe. That's another 20%. But the third year, they brought the Lord's tithe, the festival tithe, and a poor tithe, and that tithe was a welfare system. Now, notice what that was for, and let me read this. At the end of 3 years, thou shalt bring forth all the tithe of thine increase the same year, and shall lay it up within thy gates. And the Levite, because he hath no part nor inheritance with thee, and the stranger, and the fatherless, and the widow, which are within thy gates, shall come and shall eat and be satisfied, that the Lord thy God may bless thee, and all the work of thine hand which thou doest. So that was the poor tithe. So they didn't have one tithe, they had 3 tithes. Now, I was reading, and here's what I found out. Some commenters, some commentaries say this. that you bring 2 tithes one year, they brought 2 tithes the second year, and then the third year they brought 3 tithes. All right? Now, if that's the case, then their tithing tax system was 23.33%, not 10%. 23.33%. But other commentaries said, no, that's not right at all. That's not what they were required to do. He said, here's what they were required to do. The first year, they bring the Lord's tithe and the festival tithe and then put back 10%. The second year, they were to bring the Lord's tithe, the festival tithe, and then put back 10%. Then the third year, they were to bring the Lord's tithe and the festival tithe, and then that 30% that they had brought back. So listen, just to be safe, we better bring 30%, not 23.33%, all right? See? So we really don't know whether then the total tithe was 30% of their income or 23.33% of their income. But it was one or the other. Now that was their tithe system. That was to support the tribe of Levi who had no land, had no inheritance. It was also the festival tithe where the whole nation would come together, and it was a time when families could reunite. Like I say, it's like a big family reunion, and reminisce and talk about their grandkids. And of course, they didn't have pictures of their grandkids back then, but they did. They'd been showing the rest of them their grandkids. But anyway, that's what it was for. And then the third tithe was for the poor that was in the land, the poor people. But notice in every one of these, it says include the Levi, include the Levi, include the Levi, because he doesn't have any inheritance in the land. In other words, the Levi was given a 10% to support him and his family, but also in the festival, they said share your food with the tribe of Levi, and also in the poor tax. The poor tithe says include the Levi because he doesn't. In other words, what I get from that is this. God really intended for Israel to take care of the Levites. You know what you get out of it? Don't slight the Levites. Why? Because they're a gift to you. You see, God could have given them land too. But he said, because I didn't, they're a gift to you. And they're to bless you. See, they're to bless you. So that was the 3 tithes. But now that wasn't all of their obligated giving or their required giving. Okay, then in Nehemiah, the 10th chapter, if you would like to turn to that, 22 through 33. Now, I'm not going to take the time to read that, but you can read it. You can mark it and take it home and read it. But what you'll find out is this. Not only did they have the tithes, they had a temple tax. Once a year, when you came to the temple, you had to pay a temple tax. And the temple tax was 1/3 of a shekel. And the whole purpose of that was so that the priest could buy meal and different things that they need to continue on the continual sacrifice. So they had the 3 tithes, plus they had a temple tax that they had to pay. Then they had another law. Now look at this. It's Leviticus 19, 9 and 10. Leviticus 19, 9 and 10. And this was a law, and it was also a required offering, required giving. And it had to do with reaping the fields, with harvesting. Verse 9 and 10. And when ye reap the harvest of your land, thou shalt not wholly reap the corners of thy field, neither shalt thou gather the gleanings of thy harvest. And thou shalt not glean thy vineyard, neither shalt thou gather every grape of the vineyard. Thou shalt leave them for the poor and stranger. I am the Lord your God. So here's what he told Israel. When you raise your crops and it's time to harvest your crops, the reapers are to go through there, but don't reap the corners of the field. And when you go through, he said, if you drop something, don't pick it up. You can't go back over the field the second time. You leave that for the poor people. And we remember the story of Ruth and Boaz. How many remember that? Now, I want to get into that just a little bit. If you remember, Naomi went down to the country of Moab. Her husband and her 2 sons, and they married, 2 sons married some women there. They were Moabites, married those. And then her husband and 2 sons died. And if you remember, Ruth came back with her. Well, when they got back in the land, Ruth, it says, haply, in other words, accidentally came to the field of Boaz. Now, Boaz's men were reaping the field. It was harvest time. And Boaz said, who is that lady? And they said, well, that's Naomi's daughter-in-law. And she lost her husband. Well, he was kin to that family. So he told Ruth, he said, now Ruth, don't go reap anywhere else, or don't go glean. They were called gleaners. They were gleaners. The reapers come through the first time, and then the gleaners came through and picked up what was left. He said, don't go anywhere else. I want you to just come here and work. And then he went and told the reapers, he said, now I want you to drop handfuls on purpose for her. And not only that, he said, now when she gets thirsty, you draw water for her. And when it's time to eat, he had her come and sit right at his table, and he fed her off of his table. Then he told the reapers, he said, now if she wants to, you let her get right up here where you guys are. Now here's the point. Now the letter of the law says this. You've got to let the poor people have what's dropped. But the spirit of the law says, have mercy on the poor. Drop handfuls on purpose. Do you see the difference in the letter of the law and the spirit of the law? And Boaz really blessed her. And boy, she came home with so much grain. Her mother-in-law said, where did you work today? And she said, in the field of Boaz. She said, well, you go back there tomorrow. Now see, that's what God had in mind all the time. You see, that's what God had in mind. Those are your kinfolks, and they're poor, and you help them, and you give to them. I'll tell you, Boaz was a great man. He was a man that really had love in his heart. And he gave her handfuls on purpose and said, just let her work right up here among the reapers. And isn't that great? He had the right attitude, didn't he? He had the right attitude. But now that was another required giving. You couldn't go back over your fields the second time, and you couldn't reap in the corners of your fields. That was for the poor people. So that was a form of giving. Now there was another form of giving, and that form of giving was called first fruits. First fruits. Now here's what the first fruits was, and that was also to the Levites. Now the first fruits was this. When you plant tomatoes, the first ones that get ripe, the Levites get them. You can't eat them. Now, if you plant grapes, the first ones that get ripe, the Levites get them. Boy, God wanted to take care of the Levites. But that was a first fruit offering. That was commanded. Same way in your fields. Not only that, he had another offering. He said, now, the first of anything born belongs to the tribe of Levi. Now, here's the way this worked. Now, let's say, for instance, Marcia had a little Thurston Pyrumpty. That was her first baby. Now, if she was under the Jewish law, the priest, when that baby was 30 years old, he would come to the house and he'd say, is this your first child? Either son or daughter? Is it your first? Yes, it is. You've never had any more? No, you haven't. All right, then he would take the baby and he says, this baby belongs to me. It belongs to me. But if you want to redeem it, you can. So then the husband would say, I want to redeem it. So then he had to give that priest so much gold to redeem that baby. Then he gave the baby back. I mean, it was just a ceremony. The priest didn't want that baby, but it was just what God commanded. It was another form of a tax to support the Levites. Not only that, he says, now everything that's born. Now, he said if it's unclean, in other words, if it's an unclean animal, if it's like a donkey, you see, he says, you've got to redeem that too. Now, that first little baby mule or whatever that's born belongs to the Levites, but you don't give it to the Levites. You give him money in exchange for it. But now, if it's a cow or a goat or a clean animal, something they can eat, he says, you can't redeem that. He says, you've got to give them that. So do you see the tax system? Do you see how it's set up to support the Levites? So it was far more than 23 1/3%. In fact, it was, and if the three tithes amount to 30%, it was far more than 30%. So the required giving was more, maybe than even 30% by the time you add all of these up, all of these required givings. All right, so then they did something else. Well, before I want to get into that, I want to get back just a little bit. And I want to ask you, go back to the tithe. Now, did God or did Jesus teach tithing? Did Jesus teach tithing? Yes, He did. He certainly did teach tithing. Now, turn, if you will, to Matthew, the 23rd chapter. And I want you to look at the 23rd verse. And I want to show you that the New Testament does teach tithing. Let me put it this way. It's taught in the New Testament, all right? 23rd verse. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For ye pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin, and have omitted the weightier matters of the law, judgment, mercy, and faith. These ought you to have done, and not to leave the other undone. In other words, what did Jesus tell all those Pharisees? He said, you separate the tea leaves, all these little seeds and spices, you're very particular to pay your tithes. And He said, you're supposed to. But you're omitting the weightier matters of the law. Now, why did He say that? Because they were under law. You see, the law didn't end until Jesus died on the cross. Jesus was a Jew born under the law. He was under the law. Do you remember when He healed the lepers? After He healed them, He said, now you go and show yourself to the priest. Why? Because the law of Moses commanded that if you were healed of leprosy, you go to the high priest. He would examine you to be sure that you were healed, and then you made a particular type of offering, a sacrifice. Jesus was under the law, and all those people there until the cross was under the law. Look at verse 1 in chapter 23, and look what Jesus says. Then spake Jesus to the multitude and to the disciples, saying, the scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. In other words, they're in authority. They are in authority. They're the rulers of the nation of Israel. Look what He tells them. All therefore, whatsoever they bid you observe, that observe and do. But not ye after their works, for they say and do not. In other words, here's what He's saying. He said, now these scribes and Pharisees, they're in authority. They're the rulers of the nation of Israel. So whatever they tell you to do, you do it. Why? Because they were under the law. He said, you're supposed to do it. But He said, don't do like they do. He says, because they're not doing it right. Now, how were they doing it? Boy, they was doing it all for show. You know how the Pharisees gave their money? All right, when they come in the temple, there were 13 silver trumpets, like funnels, and the trumpets dropped down into the money box. And they would bring their satchels of money, and they would be announced, so-and-so is giving his tithes. And so they'd stand back and they'd throw those golden coins in those silver trumpets and clang and bang and clang and bang and fall down in that box. And it'd draw attention. Say, oh, look what they're doing. Bang, bang, bang. Everything they did for show. But what did Jesus say? How did He say to give? Don't let your right hand know what your left hand does. Because if you're doing it just for show, He said, you got your reward. But He said, do it in secret, and God will reward you openly. But they did it in show. All right, now Jesus was standing there, and He was watching all these Pharisees. And these Pharisees come in, and they'd announce this brother so-and-so, and it's time for him to give, and the rich merchants, and it's kind of like a contest to see who's giving the most, see? And they're throwing their money in those money boxes and clanging and sounding trumpets and all that kind of stuff to draw attention. But there's a little widow woman came in there, and Jesus was just watching them. And she threw in 1/4 of a cent. 2 little coins, each one was worth 1/8 of a cent apiece. She threw it in. Jesus told His disciples, said, you see that little widow woman? He said, she gave more than all these other guys put together. And they probably thought, well, she just gave 1/4 of a cent. He said, let me tell you why. He said, they gave out of their abundance. They could afford it. They didn't miss it. They're rich. He said she gave her very living. That's all she had to give. You see, let me tell you something. God is far more interested in what you've got left than what you gave. You see what I'm saying? Now let me give you an illustration. A man could walk in here and he might have $10 million in the bank. He could throw $500,000 in the collection plate. Now the way we'd look at it is, whoa, my goodness. But there might be one of these little widows that come in here, puts $2 in the collection plate. But that $2 really means a lot to her because she don't have much. That guy could give $500,000, never look back. See, God's more interested in in other words, sacrificial giving is what God's looking at. What have you got left after you get through giving? Not how much did you give. Because keep this in mind, God don't need your money. The whole purpose of giving, God isn't raising money, He's raising children. You see? It's the attitude of the heart that He's interested in. And He says these Pharisees, they was making a big deal and they was tithing and all this. But He said you have omitted the weightier matters of the law. You make a big show in your giving, but He says you don't have any love. You don't have any judgment. Now what that means in judgment is this. The rich people, oh boy, blah, 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 you sit right here, and this poor guy, you go back there and sit. They weren't judging right. He said that's the more important part of the law. He said you've omitted the weightier matters of the law. Now He didn't tell them not to tithe. He said you're supposed to tithe. You're under the law. You're under the Constitution of Israel. And they were until the cross. You see what I'm saying? Now, here's something that happened. Way back in Nehemiah, the Jews got to where they wasn't paying their tithes. And they were practically starving the Levites to death. In fact, the Levites had to leave the temple and they went to that little patch of ground trying to eke out a living. The nation was starving them to death. What a shame. What a disgrace. They weren't bringing their tithes in. Now look what it says in Malachi. The 3rd chapter in Malachi. God asked the question, verse 8, will a man rob God? Yet ye have robbed me. But ye say, wherein have we robbed thee? He says, in tithes and offerings. Ye are cursed with a curse, for ye have robbed me. Who robbed him? Even this whole nation. Who's he talking about? The nation of Israel. You can't apply that to the church. He's not talking to the church. He's talking to the nation of Israel who was under the Mosaic covenant. And he says, you have robbed me in tithes and offerings. Now, I want to tell you something. If I take this verse right here, and I've heard preachers do this, but if I take this verse and preach it to the church, that is the worst case scenario of taking Scripture out of context I believe I've ever seen. That is not applied to the church. He is talking to the children of Israel, and not only that, He says, bring all the tithes into the storehouse of God. Now, if I'm going to use this for a text and preach it to you people, then I'm going to have to tell you, bring all of the tithes. Not just the Levite tithe, not just the festival tithe, but the poor tithe. Not only that, you better bring the temple tax and the first fruits. Do you see what I'm saying? It doesn't apply to the church. It doesn't apply to the church. He's talking to Israel. They had starved the Levites to death. They were starved out. And He said, you're robbing God. You're robbing God because this is God's government. It's a theocracy. And you are robbing these people, starving these people that I've given to you to bless you. Now, I'll tell you why I never have preached tithing. It's because I can't find a text. If I could find a text, I'd preach it. But there's no text in Scripture where you can preach tithing to the church. It's just not in there. All of the tithes relate to the nation of Israel. It never relates to the church. You won't find one place in the whole entire Bible where the tithe relates to the church age or the age of grace. It relates to only the nation of Israel. But I'll tell you this, if I'm going to preach tithing, I'm going to do it right, and you ain't going to like it. Because you're going to bring all 3 tithes. But if you don't, you're robbing God. Now don't bring 10% and tell me you're tithing, because you're not. You bring 30% or 23 1/3%. I might let you get by with that. And don't bring it to the church. You give it to me. Because where did they take the tithe? To the Levite priest. Isn't that right? I mean, if we're going to do it, let's do it right. But brothers and sisters, that's not the way. That is nation of Israel's covenant. That's their constitution. It wasn't given to the church. Now, we're going to find that out later in the study. When we get over into the dispensation of grace, we're going to find out where did all this end and how are we supposed to give under our dispensation. Now, I want to get in required giving, but on top of all of the required givings, and there was even more than what I brought out. There were other required givings. Then they had their free will offerings. God delighted in the free will offerings. If you will, turn to Exodus, the 35th chapter. Verse 5. Now, God had, this is a period of time right here where Moses had come down. God had told him, right after they made their covenant, right after Israel got their constitution, and God says, now I want you, told Moses, said, I want you to build a tabernacle in the wilderness. It's called the Tabernacle of Testimony. He said, I want you to build a tabernacle, and it's going to take some money to do it. So here's what God said. Take ye from among you an offering unto the Lord. Whosoever is of a willing heart, let him bring it. An offering of the Lord, gold and silver and brass. Now, here's what God said. Now, this is a free will offering. Don't bring it if you don't want to bring it. He said, Moses, you just tell the people that want to give to this to give to this. Well, we find that the people brought stuff like you wouldn't believe. I mean, they just brought stuff and brought stuff and brought stuff and kept bringing stuff. Now, look in the 36th chapter. And they spake unto Moses, saying, the people bring much more than enough for the service of the work, which the Lord commanded to make. Isn't that something? And Moses gave commandment, and they caused it to be proclaimed throughout the camp, saying, let neither man nor woman make any more work for the offering of the sanctuary. So the people were restrained from bringing. For the stuff they had was sufficient for all the work to make, and too much. Woo, isn't that great? Isn't that great? Isn't it something? Wouldn't it be great if this church loved the Lord to the point that I'd have to say, hey, wait a minute. We're not going to pass the collections plate this Sunday. We got too much. You people are just giving out of the love of your heart, and you're giving too much. That's what happened here. I want to tell you something. People will give a lot more because of love than they will by command. Now, this church just found this out. This church just found this out. When it was made known to the members or some of the members of the church that we needed more than what we're bringing in, I mean, you people just bless me, and I know you bless God. And you've not been commanded to do it. You've done it because you saw the need. The Holy Spirit touched your heart, and you dug down in your billfolds and you give. Isn't that great? I'm proud of you. I'm proud of you. And I know God is pleased because you gave out of love. Now look, these people, I tell you what, these people are just, man, I mean, they was having a ball giving. Man, they were just bringing stuff. Oh, we love the Lord. And here Moses, here's some more, and here's some more, and here's some gold, and here's these earrings, and here's my wristwatch, and melt it down and make whatever you take, just do whatever you need to make God's tabernacle. Moses said, hey, you're giving too much. Tell the people to quit bringing this stuff in. We got too much. That's the way it should be. Did you know that? Love. See, even under the Mosaic system, if people would do that, they wouldn't have even had to have the tithe. But they were under law. All right, now look over here at, I want to show you something, and I know we're running over, but turn, if you will, to 1 Chronicles 29th chapter. Now, King David wanted to build the temple. Oh, he wanted to build the temple, but God said, no, said, David, you can't build it because you're a man of war. But he said, I will let your son Solomon build the temple. So David said, well, I want to raise the money. He really wanted to start gathering all the stuff up that needed to be gathered up so that his son Solomon would have the material, you see, to build the temple. Now let me show you what David did. Verse 3, 29th chapter. Moreover, because I have set my affection to the house of my God, I have of mine own proper good, of gold and silver, which I have given to the house of my God, over and above all that I have prepared for the holy house, even 3,000 talents of gold, of the gold of Ophir, and 7,000 talents of refined silver to overlay the walls of the house withal. Now, do you know what David's saying there? Because I loved God and I wanted to see this thing built, this temple built, David said, I gave over. In fact, here's what David gave. $100,835,000 out of his own pocket. Now, that's free will giving. Now notice this, but here's what he said. But who am I? And what is my people that we should be able to offer so willingly after this sort? For all things come of thee, and of thine own have we given thee. You know what David said? God, it's all yours. Oh God, we're just so thankful that we were permitted to give it because you gave it all to us. You see, keep this in mind. All wealth comes from the Lord. He gives every one of us the ability to earn money. Every one of us. Some more than others. But it's all God's. And I'll tell you this. This applies under the Mosaic law and this applies under grace. You can't outgive God. You can't outgive God. You show me someone that gives and gives generously, and God will bless that person.